This episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by webhealer.net. Webhealer are the go-to provider of websites for private practitioners in the UK. Established for over 20 years, Webhealer offers a non-technical and fully supported service to help therapists grow their private practice. Just one customer from your website each year pays for their service. Go to webhealer.net and use the coupon code CT100 for £100 off their Do It For Me service.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me as always is Ken. How are you diddling, Ken?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for asking, Rory. We're having a bit of a giggle here this morning. I guess the moods are high, and we hope that your mood is high as you join us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode 238, and we have three topics we're going to be covering today, starting off with our theory in practice, where we look at an element of theory and how that comes alive when it's placed into practice in real sessions. And today we're going to be speaking about those all-important boundaries in counselling. We then move on to our practice partner, which is an area where we look at the complexities, navigating the complexities of going into private practice, starting a business ourselves as a counsellor or a psychotherapist, and what we may come up across on that journey. And today we're looking at an overview of getting clients. There's going to be a kind of a global look at the different ponds we can fish in to find clients, or the clients can find us rather. And then we go on to the all-important practice matters. We love practice matters, where we take an element of practice, what we may come across, what we may see within our therapy room, and a very, very important topic today, an evergreen topic. We're talking about race, culture, anti-discrimination. Mamood Ahmad, you met up with him, Rory, to have a chat about that. It's an important one. It's a great lecture as well. So that is definitely worth sticking around for. So let's start off with that theory in practice, Rory. When we see the theories we learn in the classroom, we see them actually in practice, and sometimes the theory that we learn in the classroom and how it appears in practice can differ slightly, can't it? And today we're speaking about boundaries. So should we start by revisiting the theory of boundaries, what we learn?
Yes, well, I think the theory of boundaries is that as therapists, and certainly in the arc of training, if you are in the role of, sometimes it's referred to as helper, is that part of your job as being a helper is to manage certain areas of what you do. And the word boundaries means that you're thoughtful of how you present yourself, how you work with people, how you're respectful for people, but also how you manage time, how you manage your time. And, there is a principled position that, sometimes if you're in that seat of helper, or if you're the counsellor, you do retain an amount of power. And power in itself is pretty benign. If I think of my kettle for my morning tea, or my numerous cups of tea throughout the day, if I think of that, I handle deadly electricity on a regular basis. But the boundary for the electricity is the cable that protects me from being electrocuted. Yeah. So the power itself's benign, although it could kill me. However, the boundary is the cable, and that stops me being electrocuted. And I think that's a good way of thinking about boundaries. It is a way of stopping harm or damage.
Yeah, I like that. I love how you've used electricity there to describe boundaries. It really is. And the power dynamic of electricity. And I guess for me, boundaries, there are boundaries that we may bring into our practice that are client-facing boundaries, of maybe when a client may contact you or not contact you to protect your own time. So there are client-facing boundaries. But we also have our own boundaries of who we are as people and how we show up within our therapy room. And that may be, I take a break at least twice a year type of thing. And we might not share those with our with our clients, but they're our boundaries, and boundaries keep something preserved. I think that it creates an arena wherein there is safety. And the importance of boundaries for me in the theoretical sense is that there is a mutual understanding, specifically if we're speaking client-facing boundaries. So a client is in our therapy room, we'll be kind of speaking about how we work in therapy, where the lines are in therapy. And I'm going to use an analogy as well, Rory. Mine's not electricity. Mine is, I've been recently watching Cobra Kai. It takes me back. It's a spin-off from the film from, I think, the 1980s, The Karate Kid. And it's kind of where they are today. But there's a lot of karate in this, and they show the matches. And within a karate match, on a mat, there is drawn a boundary. And the match, the tournament, takes place within that boundary. And within that boundary, they interact with one another. And as soon as somebody takes a step outside of that boundary, it's out of bounds. They stop the fight, they stop the tournament, and they have to come back into the boundaries again. The boundaries mark a place where we do not step over. A boundary is something that is fixed. It is not something movable. So, for example, if a boundary is pushed up against by a client, maybe we say, I can't be contacted outside of hours, and you may have a client, and I'm just making this up as I'm going along, coming to your practice without an appointment and showing up, and you have outlined in your boundaries that that's not to be done. We would need to reset that boundary with the client. It's not movable. We can't go, on this occasion, okay, I'm going to see you. And you may well see them, but you might, when you next see them in therapy, go, I recognize that we decided you would not come to me out of hours, but you showed up at my practice out of hours. I'll wonder about how we can reinstate that. You'd look to reinstate. They don't move. You can't move it a bit and move it back a bit. It needs to be reinstated. I think that, for me, is important on the theory of boundaries.
Yes, and as with everything we do in counselling, it lives in the contract.
Oh yes,
which is probably another podcast episode at some point. But it lives in the contract. It's a mutual understanding of what's on offer, what can be offered, and I think it extends a little bit beyond the contract about what your personal boundaries are. So you've touched on contacting out of hours, initially, certainly when I started training 20 years ago, that would have been the practice rooms, because social media didn't exist in those days. Facebook was something that people didn't own computers. It's hard to believe that, isn't it? I've stated that people didn't own computers. How old are you, Rory? Not that old. And nowadays, of course, we could be contacted on a myriad of platforms. Yeah. And I think it's important that we think about how we can be contacted and the immediacy of the way that we can be contacted. There's a big difference between getting up, getting some transport, going to a practice, sitting outside and waiting for your therapist, than there is picking up a mobile phone and just doing a private message or sending an email. So we need to be thoughtful of that. And I think one of the boundaries that I learned very early on in my training, my introduction to counselling, one September, so it was the September intake, and I remember we were given a task of 10 minutes either way, just share a little bit about yourselves and learn those attending and listening skills. And I was intently listening to this person, and when they took a pause, I looked round, and myself and the person in front of me were the only people who were sat in their pair doing skills. Everyone else had got on with the next part of the lesson. And I just let the time run away with me. And the tutor had allowed it because she wanted to teach me a lesson. So it's a very good lesson. But what she also said was, you've actually disadvantaged the person who's playing your client, because you said you'd work for 10 minutes and you're actually working for 25. So you've actually held her up as well. So boundaries aren't always about us. They're about how we work in the service of the people we're supporting, if that makes sense.
100%. Time boundary is a massive one, and it's an evergreen. You're going to recognize it from your own practice. If you're in practice, if you're a student, you're going to go into practice, you're going to see it there as well. And as you kind of quite rightly said, Rory, you'll even see it in your skills practice with your peers. Time boundary is so important and sometimes tricky. Now, this is about taking the theory, putting it into practice. Sometimes time boundary is tricky to implement, specifically when you have a client that's in full flow. And you're looking and you see, okay, we got 5 minutes left in this session. How do I stop them? Do I say, oh, hold on a minute there, Rory, if you don't mind, we've only got 5 minutes left. And is that being rude? Is that being interruptive? Or, as you've just said, Rory, is it in service of the client? And of course, we know as mature practitioners, that is in service of the client. You know, we may need to wedge in and say, you know, there's only just to let you know, we have about 5 minutes left of our session. Why is that in service of the client? Well, because if the client is in full flow, they can choose to modulate what they bring next. They themselves can go, okay, there's where that boundary sits. I can start closing down now. So they share the responsibility of the boundary with you, and if we don't say it, we're not giving that opportunity. And you mentioned, Rory, the boundaries and how they've changed, and I think this is really important, specifically if you trained many years ago, as both you and I did, Rory. Technology has changed the way that clients engage with therapy. First contact through to actual therapy online, via text, via email, has changed considerably. And as technology changes, so our boundaries change. Like you say, Rory, you know, now you can be interrupted by a text or a telephone call. What are you agreeing with your clients around that digital contact outside of your practice time? How are you working with that? And of course, if we're working online, we're going to have different boundaries in place than if we were working within a physical, face-to-face, two people in the room setting, because we have to take the technology into consideration, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a topic that repeatedly comes up in our Facebook group. And if you want to join our Facebook group and you're not a member, then why not join the party? Go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll see us. We're a closed group, but knock on the door and our friendly moderation team will let you in, and you can join the party, talking and interacting with thousands of like-minded people. Some are students, some are qualified practitioners. We have some tutors in there as well, and supervisors, and they all we all engage in this wonderful conversation around the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And I guess one of the things that comes up in the Facebook page is touch, Ken.
Oh, yes.
Touch is an interesting boundary. I will self-disclose it. I don't really like people rushing up and hugging me. I don't mind embracing people if I know them, but if someone sort of decides he wants to give me a hug for no better reason than, well, basically it makes them feel better, it does feel a little uncomfortable. And I think that's something that novice therapists sometimes need to manage. That's a boundary that needs to manage. And I often said when I taught, if you're giving a hug, ask this fundamental question: who really is it for? Is it for the client or is it for you? And I think most people think, well, actually, I think it's for the client, but actually it's for me. And touch is a very touchy subject in counselling, isn't it?
It is, Rory. And I think that this comes down to each person and your way. You're listening to this. Your way of interacting with your practice is going to determine your boundaries. Yeah. And that's why Rory and I can't give you a list of boundaries and go, here you go, here's the boundaries. I mean, there are certain boundaries that are ethical and legal, mapped to the ethical framework of your ethical body, or mapped to the law of your country. And those are no-brainer boundaries. You know, they're easy to understand and we need to work within them. But then there is the nuanced boundaries of who you are as a person. And similar to what you've spoken about, Rory, I've been in many a supervision session speaking about touch and what that's about, and what happens when that touch is kind of instigated from the client's perspective. So I think it's different if I'm pretty much in the same camp as you, Rory. The last thing I would want to do in a session is get to a point where I say, you know what, you look like you could do with a nice hug now to a client, because I'd be introducing that, and that's a no-go area for me. But if a client was to say, what I need to tell you right now is really, really challenging for me, I wonder, could I just hold your hand when I say this to you? You know? Now, what might you do? That's the question here. It's not about what I would do or what would Rory do. And I spent many an hour in supervision just speaking about that. Or if a client instigates the hug after the session, wow, thank you very much. Do you mind if I give you a hug? Coming from the client, and how we act and interact with that. So there's the nuance of boundaries that are going to be a fit for you, how you practice your client group. And I guess an interesting boundary, and this I think falls into ethics and in best service of clients, is working within our competence. Now, do you see working within competence as a boundary? You know, if you've got a client who comes along to that very first session, so you were speaking about contracting, Rory, right in the beginning, we get to lay out those boundaries. Client coming in, and maybe that person says, you know, I feel that I'm addicted to prescription medication. I'm drinking every night. I want to stop the drinking, and the prescription medication is making me fuzzy all day at work, and I'm feeling that I'm not able to interact. I wonder, how might we view that person coming in? Now, if you have experience and you've done training in working with alcohol and working with pharmaceuticals or narcotics, then you're going to be right at home to work there. But is there an alarm or a trigger that would go and say, hold on a second, this is not within my competence range. I haven't trained deeply enough in this. I need to refer this client on. Is that a boundary where we reach that point of making that decision? These are the boundaries presenting in real life therapy, because that is going to happen. Somebody is going to present with a presentation that maybe doesn't 100% fit with your training, your modality, or how you can best serve that client, Rory.
Absolutely. And you spoke earlier about touch being something that you discussed in supervision a lot.
Yeah.
Limits of competence seem to be a recurring theme in my supervision.
Yeah.
And because I think I only speak for myself here, I think that I need to audit myself to think, can I work with this client? Am I offering the best service to this client? And I think if we translate that as a qualified practitioner, and we move slightly down downstream, if you like, to when we're students, it also links into giving advice. Because I think one of the things I used to see with students, and I've done it myself as a student, was that somebody would talk about an issue, and they would say, "Oh, well, this is what you need to do." And of course, that's a boundary issue. That is almost like working outside your competence, because what you're saying is, I believe this to be true, even though it's not true for you. And why don't you do that? And I think that, as a student, is something that sometimes needs addressing. The fact that advice giving is just as a touchy in terms of boundaries as a qualified practitioner working outside their limits of knowledge.
Oh, I love this. I love this discussion because it shows itself as a spectrum. Because as you were sharing that, Rory, I was thinking about a CBT therapist who would very gladly be giving advice. What you want to do when you feel that panic attack coming on is you want to do these exercises. Boundaries are specific to you. They're specific to your practice. They're specific to your training. They're specific to your modality. They're specific to the client group that you're seeing. It's a really, really interesting topic. As Rory and I say all the time, we're not the experts. We're not sitting here professing to know everything about boundaries. We're two peers discussing a topic that we know is important and that we see again and again in our Facebook group being discussed. And here's a challenge, it doesn't matter how long you have been qualified, or take boundaries to your next supervision, perhaps. Take it in and go and say to your supervisor, I've been thinking about my boundaries and I want to discuss this, and see where that conversation goes, because it can be rich, it can be deep, it can be meaningful. it's been challenging for me today, Rory, because a couple of things have flagged up where I've gone, oh, that's interesting, you know, and I'll take this away and there's some reflection from today. And hopefully you as the listener have got some reflection from it as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And, you know, don't hesitate to bring it up in your training groups and to get feedback on boundaries. I think it should be a consistent conversation within both training and practice, and one that you go to on a regular basis as a part of reflection. You know, am I being bounded enough? Because I think there's a quote I saw by Byrne Brown, who's an author and I believe a psychologist, and she said, compassionate people tend to be the most boundaried. And that would be my observation. Yeah. Because they're allowing autonomy. They're allowing somebody to develop themselves. They're not kind of infusing themselves into the other person and making them a clone of them. They're allowing autonomy, and ultimately boundaries, I think speak to autonomy, and autonomy is what we aim for as therapists.
We have 3 sections in the Counselling Tutor podcast, and the boundary suggests that we've come to the end of theory and practice, Rory. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by counsellingskillsacademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to counsellingskillsacademy.com.
Well, I'll take that boundary and move on to the next part then, Ken.
So Practice Partner, that's where we look at your practice if you are considering going into private practice or you are in private practice. And we just have a general discussion about what we may face and different topics that come up related to running a practice, starting a practice. And today, I think that the mother of all topics are getting clients. I think it's perceived as the be-all and end-all of being in private practice. And in reality, it's a very small part of practice. And if you listen to our series of Practice Partner, you'll hear how I guess how detailed starting and running a business is. And getting clients is just one aspect of that, but it is of course an important aspect. Rory, we've spoken about business planning, about what running a business is in previous episodes, and part of running a business is that you are able to support yourself doing what you love and being in service of your clients. And in order to do that, I guess we need to have some clients. Where do we get them from, Rory?
Well, I think it's an interesting one, and I think you spoke a universal truth. If you're self-employed, if you're part of your employment self-employed and you're paying your bills by the work you do, which is a principled, honourable position in my view, having clients that allow you to charge your fee is important. And where do you look? And I think that there are so many different areas, there's so many ponds to fish in. But I think as an overview, and we may very well do a deep dive into each of these little ponds, you need, first of all, I think, to look at what ponds, to use a fishing, I'm stretching this fishing analogy now, what ponds you want to fish in. And there are quite a few. I mean, you could start off with counselling directories. There are lots of directories that allow you to advertise your services. Some are independent. Some are connected to your ethical bodies. Some are specific directories for specific client groups. So I'm thinking of the LGBTQ plus client groups. There are specific directories, which I have to say would probably have to evidence your competence in. So there's a way of starting. Those are just, those are the kind of more traditional routes of finding clients.
Yeah, indeed. And, it's interesting because I think this is going to be as unique as you are and your client group is and how you choose to practice and where you choose to practice. So when you're talking about directories, generally, this is the new way that people are finding services that they're looking for. So if I was to say to you listening to this now, if you needed a new item in your home, how might you go about finding out what is the best item? And chances are you may say that you might go online and do a search. And I certainly do a search, and I look at reviews of different items before I buy them. And I feel that I'm making an informed decision when I do so. But in reality, it's showing how behavior has changed over the years. Because if we go back, Rory, back to the days when there was no computers, we were speaking about that a little earlier in this podcast. Yeah, my daughter doesn't, and she's 19. A scary world. Then you might go to a Yellow Pages, or you might ask people for recommendations. And it was a very different way of finding services. So many people may go online and use a search engine, perhaps Google, to say, I need counselling, or find a counsellor, or counsellor in my area, or counselling near me, or counsellor for depression, or counsellor for loss or grief, or whatever it is. They'll be looking specifically. And you were speaking about the directories. What directories do well, and where directories show their worth, is in how they appear in those searches. So a directory will spend time and money on making sure that they are optimized for search engines so that they are found, and they may pay or have what is called an organic listing, where their content is seen as authority, and they will rise up and they will be seen on that first page of Google, and it may get clicks. And if that directory gets clicks and you are listed within that directory, then there is an opportunity for people to browse to see your listing and to perhaps choose to contact you. Specifically, if you're niching down, and when I say niching down, I'm talking about those specialist areas that you spoke about, Rory. There are directories that would specialize in certain areas. We certainly run one through Counselling Tutor. We have a directory for supervisors who are qualified to supervise online practitioners. And we started that directory because we saw that there was a need for that. So many practitioners now working online. Our ethical bodies within the frameworks call us to have supervision within the modality we are working. And there was a shortage, I guess, at one stage of clinical supervisors who were trained in online working to supervise online practitioners. We offer a course on that. And as part of the graduation of that course, we have a directory, and that is for online supervisors. So therefore, the traffic, or the people that go and search on that directory, are looking for something very, very specific. And it's a very specific qualification set that is matched up with them over there. So directories do cost. And as Rory quite rightly said, we will maybe do a deeper dive just speaking about directories and how you can list yourself, and how you can maybe pop out from other people that are advertising on a directory. The money you spend on a directory usually is paired in with your membership, perhaps. So if you have an ethical body that has a directory, they may ask you for a little extra money, and then you can list within their directory, and they would show your advert. There are independent directories who put their money into coming first on Google, and they will charge you a fee, and the same is true, and you will get the inquiries coming through from directories. So I think that's a good area. It's modern, it is popular, and many say that it is effective, Rory.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I at some point we will talk about maybe how to write your listing to make your listing stand out, because it is a very crowded marketplace. Yep. It's rather like the marketplace. Near I live, we have a vibrant market, and we have a man who sells towels, and you'd always know his store because he's very vibrant. He stands out. You know, you want to go if you're in the market to buy a towel, you would go there because you know him, and I think that as part of developing, your way that you get clients is to think about what it is you're offering, how you present yourself, maybe even thinking about, is there a niche that you can offer certain client groups, certain presentations, trauma being one of them. So yeah. But I do think you have to put that in your mind. How do I get my clients? And more to the point, how do I do that over a long period of time? Because this is your employment. So this isn't, when you're thinking about getting clients, this isn't just for this week or next week. It should be part of your business plan to look at how you get clients and to measure, I think, the effectiveness of where you are looking. So if you're in a directory, it's very simple just to put a Excel sheet up and say, I've been in that directory a month. How many referrals that have turned to clients have I got? And then you can work out where your best fishing is. It is literally like fishing, isn't it, Ken? You just say this pond is better than that pond. And I don't want to kind of reduce something that's so important down to fishing, but effectively, I think it's a useful metaphor.
It is, and it's all about being visible. If you're not visible in your business of being a therapist, and you're not there for the people that are looking for you, then they're not going to see you and they're not going to contact you. So being qualified, wanting to be in private practice, and having all of that motivation does not get clients. We need to take action, and sometimes that can be a slow process. So speaking about directories, they're kind of a quick fix. But again, as Rory has said, it's a crowded market. You're in a directory with thousands, if not tens of thousands of other therapists that you're competing against. And you might go, okay, well, at least my area will narrow that down. And that's 100% true. Your area can narrow that down. Your specialism can narrow that down. And it's about the narrowing down to be seen. So there's one area. Another area is within your local area. How can you get referrals in from organizations where your client group may present? Are there professionals that people in your area, if you work locally and you have an in-person practice or even an online practice and you're looking for local clients, are there professionals within your area that a client may go to and present in a way that they are looking for a counselor or looking for someone to speak to? And can you create a referral relationship with those professionals? It's a longer and slower burn. So it's not like a directory listing where you go and put your listing up today and perhaps tomorrow you may have an inquiry. With referrals, it's about relationship building. And if you're working online, maybe that referral net can be stretched a little wider. And certainly in our online and telephone counseling training, we speak about the importance of digital referrals. If you're working online with clients, they're not going to be in your area. You can't refer to local services, and local services maybe can or can't refer to you depending on what you offer. But you have a wider net. So if you're working online, maybe you can cast that net wider. Who is your client group likely to connect with a recognition that they want that your services would be useful, and how can you arrange a referral from that person? I'm thinking back to when I was in placement, and when I was in placement, I worked in NHS in doctor's surgeries. That was where I did my placement, and I would get referrals from the surgery that I worked in, because not all of the clients that went to a doctor, maybe with difficulties that they were facing or depression, and asked for counselling, not all of them wanted to go on the waiting list for the NHS counsellor. So the practitioners within the practice would say, well, you can go on the waiting list, or alternatively, our counsellor that works here does see clients privately as well. And I would get a number of referrals through that relationship, I guess. So there's a consideration and a practical world example of how that might work. But it's about your practice. Who might refer to you? There's another pond in which you can fish.
Absolutely. And we'll be looking at the different types of ponds that are available for fishing in. I guess finally on this, the other area you could look at is local businesses. Businesses who employ staff. They have a HR function, a human resources function, and part of that may be offering support for staff who are going through difficult times or need some support with issues of emotional issues. And certainly in my time as a therapist, I've had some referrals from organisations, and I would absolutely echo your sentiment about building relationships. It's not just about taking the clients; it's about speaking to the people who've referred them, trying to understand a little bit about what that mechanism looks like, about the kind of issues that they're facing, and you can build a very good relationship, because even if you might not be able to help with, even though they may be sending counselling clients to you, they may phone you up for some advice on maybe a different issue, where you could say, well, actually, there's someone in my network who may be able to help with that. We talked earlier in the podcast about, substance misuse, alcohol or drugs misuse. So, if you've got a contact, then you then become useful. You can say, oh, well, I don't deal with that, but I can refer you to someone I know, a colleague who deals with that. And you become quite a valuable asset to organizations, because they know that if they have a difficulty, they can phone you up and you can provide a solution. So don't underestimate relationship building. I think it's a really good way of obtaining clients.
I agree with you. And relationship building and networking, so professionally held relationships, specifically if you're doing any specific CPD. And again, I'm going to refer to our supervision training that we offer. Within our supervision training, you may have a practitioner who has a specialist area. They may work with children and young people, and they would be learning supervision. But then you might have another person learning supervision who doesn't have that expertise group, who a supervisee comes to them and they'll go, oh, actually, I do know a supervisor who does work online, who does supervise online practices and does have a specialism in working with children and young people. And there's a professional opportunity to refer. If you are doing CPD, or if you're on a course, make sure you keep contact with the people on the course, because it can develop into professional relationships. And I think it would be remiss to leave this topic without considering that when you're looking for clients, we need to understand that the client goes through a journey. So the client's going to go through a consideration journey. They have choice. In the same way, we started this off of saying if you were looking for a product, you might go on Google to look for that. Maybe you would end up on comparing different shops and the same product across different shops. Well, the same is true as clients. People are discerning. There is more choice in the digital age. And I think it reflects the importance of having a website or having a digital presence where a person can learn a little bit more about you. So, for example, if we're talking about being on a listing site, with a listing, you might have a link to your website where somebody can learn a little bit more about you. We have a great sponsor for our podcast, webhealer.net, and of course they have the special for Counselling Tutor. So you hear that at the beginning of each and every podcast. They're our sponsor. And of course, there are other ways of getting a website, but having a website who says who you are, the clients that you work with, and kind of a little bit more about how you work, so important for that consideration stage that a potential client is going through when they may be comparing one to another and looking for who might be the best fit for them. And that is called owned media, when you have your own website. And there are a number of different ways of getting that. And we will have more episodes where we'll speak more in depth about websites. And then the last thing that I wanted to speak about is paid media. And paid media is where you are placing adverts maybe on Google, where it's called Google AdWords, where you would target certain keywords. So you might target the word looking for counselor, and you could make it that if anybody put looking for counselor into Google, that you could pay a fee to have your website show up at the top. And the same is true on Facebook. You can have certain adverts show up for certain demographics or certain types of people. I think that is definitely a whole episode in its own, digital marketing, digital advertising online. But it is certainly another way that people get clients. It is also more immediate. You pay a fee. You only pay if the person clicks on your ad, which means they're visiting your website, which means they've had an intent in terms of the keyword looking for counselor, and then they click on your website. It means that they're closer to you, and you're only paying if they do click on your website. Of course, they may get in contact with you, they may not, they may go away. You still pay for the click, and that's how digital advertising works. A number of different ways of getting clients. Of course, there's many, many, many more ways of getting clients. Please share your way of getting clients in our Facebook group. Go to Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, come and join the conversation. of like-minded individuals, Rory.
Yes, absolutely. And as we work through the podcast, we'll be doing in-depth and deep dives into each individual area, talking about the advantages and the challenges of finding clients, primarily in a digital domain.
Which brings us neatly on to Practice Matters. I love Practice Matters. I say that every episode, Rory, but I do, because I learn so much from Practice Matters, because we're hearing from experts out there.
Yes, it's a growing, this is a growing edge of professional competence, race culture, anti-discrimination practice competence. And Mamood Ahmad has developed a specific framework for this and specific training. And I interviewed him on a lecture he gave for the Counsellor CSR library, the Counselling Study Resource Library, as we call it, and our CPD library for qualified practitioners on race, culture, and anti-discrimination practice framework. And this is what he had to say.
Practice Matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
And I'm joined by Mamood Ahmad. Again, second time I've had the pleasure of interviewing you, Mamood. and you're here today to talk about the lecture that you've produced for the Counsellor CPD Library and the CSR Library, entitled Understanding the Race, Culture and Anti-Discrimination Practice Competence Framework. So first of all, Mamood Ahmad, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much for inviting me back. The second time, I must have done something right.
Absolutely. So just tell me a little bit about the Anti-Discrimination Competence Framework, because this is the real thrust of your lecture, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an area, as we were talking before, that we haven't really adequately covered in terms of curriculum. So really what it's about is our human experience of being a particular identity, whether it's nationality, or whether it's race, culture, to really become aware of our cultural worldview, our society's worldviews, our family's worldviews, and to be able to use that in therapy to provide better outcomes. So, and particularly when we talk about diversity and the big 8 characteristics, we need to consider how we're working in a way that doesn't recreate societal discrimination, bad language, etc., microaggressions in the therapy room as well. So it's really important that we get this right. There's tons of evidence, first of all, that the therapeutic isn't up to standard overall for many groups, like based on ethnicity, race, and culture, neurodivergence, etc. That we need to improve that, and we also need to consider as therapists that there is ample and tons of evidence that says the mental health of these groups, people from these groups, is far poorer because of that.
Yes. And there is something called dual burden, isn't there? The fact that people are, struggling, but also they're being, they're struggling as well as being a minority group, and it's sometimes referred to as dual burden. We talked off air before we recorded this, and one of the things that came up was the fact that, there needs to be a more in-depth understanding of otherness. And I'm really taken with that word, understanding that when you meet someone in the therapy room, that you should meet them where they're at, and that would encompass all of them. And I guess your training is about trying to get therapists to think of people as the other in all their difference. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it's the classic wholeness, of the person. So someone's cultural, whether it's a strength, whether they believe in it, that's up to the individual, obviously. whether that's important or relevant, it could be a factor. But you're right. If we are seeing a client and we only see part of them because of our own identity, let's say, and we don't go there, for example, or don't have enough knowledge of how to broach it, how to get into that, how to bring out the stories, the narratives, the conflicts, then we are missing a part of them. We're actually going to be seeing one side of them, perhaps, if that's the case, of that person, because obviously the power dynamics in society, etc. We need to consider actively how we build relationships, how we work with these clients, so we can see the wholeness of them. And it's such a liberating experience, I think, personally, to have a therapist, especially one who has a different identity, to take an interest. Yeah. And even if it isn't about the actual problem or factor in there, but just imagine a therapist who takes an interest to see parts of you that others haven't, yeah, or haven't even bothered to broach.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree, and I think that there's the old saying, which I fear I may have coined, which says the therapist can only go as far, the client can only go as far as the therapist has gone themselves. There shouldn't be any areas of blankness for a therapist in terms of understanding otherness. And my view is, I think it's absolutely ethically important and humanly important that as therapists, we try our very best to have a strong understanding and a commitment to race, culture and anti-discriminatory practice. It's not, as when I trained in the 2000s, a kind of nod to otherness. It's about involving yourself in otherness and really trying to understand the person in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sums up really well. It's about, I like to use the word which comes from development theory, is about immersion with an I and immersion with an E, which is like actually you're really absorbing yourself into the sea of otherness and difference, and you're meeting people there, and losing that sort of fear behind it, and connecting in ways that I believe you may not have ever experienced ever before. And that's a amazing thing if you were open to do that. That's what I believe personally about this whole area, is that we're missing a lot. And one thing I maybe also to say is that, going back to let's say you're white British, it's quite shocking to me that we wouldn't consider the transgenerational experience, the national experience, the cultural experience, the Western experience, the English experience, the Yorkshire experience,
yes,
and the traumas that we that we can carry. And I think this is a ubiquitous thing, that families carry as well. So to consider that cultural aspects of living in your society is an important part of not only our own work, but also the awareness of, hold on here, I am in this pond of water. Let's examine what this pond looks like. What's the ingredients of this pond or this river? Yeah, and and that brings a greater amount of depth of awareness into practice, I believe. And it also can make and drop some of our defenses and sort of go into a sort of place of, I am cultural as well. And I'm open. I want to understand what that means, not only just to me and my ancestry and my Western worldview, but also what it means in terms of others from different heritage, different culture. Even if it's important, even if it's a white, let's say, a white British client.
Yes, I mean, I think that's interesting. I think you've hit on a very interesting point. If we just looked at white British experience, it is not one homogenous group of people with light skin. You talked about the Yorkshire experience, and certainly as a younger man, the traumas of, that people in certainly in the northeast experience with their manufacturing and their societies being decimated by the government of the day's policies. And I used to travel a lot, and it was really fascinating to see how the difference in their life experience to mine. I lived in Manchester. I'd go to Newcastle. I'd go to the mining societies in Yorkshire and see how their cultures were being effective. And I guess if we spread that out to otherness in every aspect, be that, gender, sexuality, race and culture, I think that gives a pretty good clue in that everybody is the other. We live in a world of otherness.
Yeah, absolutely. So we live in a world of otherness. We live in a world of difference. And as I spoke to you before this session, I talked about that exam question of, have you ever experienced power being used against you? And that's a pause moment for a lot of people. So it connects with something deeper, but we need to be able to use that and recognize that for many of these groups, it's about societal power being used against them. It's historical, intergenerational, for example, the colonization and slavery aspects of Black people. So by connecting with that in our own, as you say, otherness and those experiences, we can then understand and be more empathetic. I believe it's not the only way, but I think it's one way of connecting with what that must be like if I'm othered as a group, not just as an individual. And that's what's happening, whether it's to do with class or anything else, any of those identities. And identities maybe we don't know anything about as important as well, is that there are groups out there, for example, travellers, Gypsy Roma people. There's obviously an abundance of mixed race experiences. Yeah. So when we start thinking about the multitude of things, we can go deeper and deeper into the sea, almost to the bottom. Probably there is no bottom to it, and that's where I think as therapists we need to be, and that's where what we're trying to do now is to try and push this integrated curriculum.
Yes, and I think there's been a lot of water analogy here, ponds, seas. But I do think to just have another analogy. I think the word immersion is really important here. It is the difference between standing on the beach, looking at the water, and thinking, well, that's quite different, and immersing yourself into it. And there may be a lot of it's a completely different experience for those who swim. In being in the water than it is looking at it or studying it in a book. Once you're immersed in it, then you're meeting it where it is. And I think that we could use that metaphor really for working cross-culturally or with otherness.
Yeah, the experiential, you're hitting it on the head really. I think that's the key. And that's the work we do, is we want to have experiences. We don't just want to teach. Teaching is easy. Experiences of otherness or bringing togetherness and connecting is where the development, I believe, is at. That's where I've seen people accelerate. Their development accelerates massively, but in a pretty short amount of time for most people.
Yeah.
Because of that experience with people. And some of it can be, tricky as well, but it's okay. Yeah,
people have to get past perhaps fear. And I think fear is the big thing that holds people back in swimming, as in doing anything else. What happens if I get it wrong? What happens if I get out of my depth? I'm really stretching these metaphors now, but
you do well.
but I think that's the whole thing. And I tell you what I really like. The question you ask your students, and maybe this is a question we should ask the audience. Maybe you should ask it to the audience. That I think that question you asked was so powerful because it fundamentally makes us the other. Ask that question to our audience, and I wonder what they'd say.
Yeah. So the question would be to just take a bit of space now, maybe pause this podcast, and write down the answer to this question. Can you tell me of experience where power has been used against you?
We don't like too many pauses in broadcasting, but I think that is.
No,
I think that is
the
a.
idea.
I think that is. I think that's a pause moment,
Yes,
Mamood.
yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people listening to this thinking, "Yeah, that happened to me." And if it happens to you, it can happen to others.
Yes.
So as we come to the end of this interview, what do you hope that people will take away from your lecture? What is the hope when the lecture ends and people have viewed it that they can take away?
Yeah, so the main takeaway here is that you use the lecture and there's a competency framework alongside it, and there's also a free mini course which we can use to describe the actual competency framework. What I would say is taking away is to go through that document and mark yourself, perhaps, self-development task. Mark yourself. Do I understand these statements? Have I used these statements? And how much knowledge do I have and practical skills do I have? And just almost mark yourself on it and get training based on that. We do training. So our training model is based on a certificate model, and there's one-day trainings as well. They're all NCS approved trainings. So we are trying to really get that out there. And also to say that we are now moving into training organizations as well, to help them reorganize their curriculum around not just about race and culture, but diversity as a whole, which centralizes race as well and class. And to get that into an integrated curriculum. So we've got pilots running there. So if you know of any institutes who are interested, please get in touch. It's part of what we call the Anti-Discrimination Foundation collective, if you like, for bringing to the people that are interested in this area. So my takeaway would be to, as it summarizes, to go and look at that lecture, go through the competency framework, ask any questions of us, do the training if you're able to. And I think that sums it up, I think.
Well, I mean, I think that it's been a really interesting dialogue, and I'm sure that a lot of people who listen to this section of the podcast have got a lot of food for thought. Mamood Ahmad's Understanding the Race, Culture and Anti-Discrimination Practice Competence Framework is available in the CSR and the
Big thank you to Mamood. A big thank you to you, Rory, for holding that discussion, that very, very important discussion. Of course, if you're interested in seeing the lecture and you are a member of the Counsellor CPD library, you can just log in and that lecture is there for you. If you're not a member of the Counsellor CPD library, visit counsellingtutor.com and all the information is there. And I believe that this lecture is also in our Counsellor Study Resource Library as well, Rory, because it is such an important topic. It's a topic that students will learn about. So if you're a student and you're a member of our Counselling Study Resource Library, you also have access to that. If you're not, again, counsellingtutor.com, all the information is there if you're interested in joining. This has been episode 238 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, Rory.
Absolutely. And we started off with theory and practice, boundaries in counselling. And I fear that I've been remiss in not mentioning the super duper handout that we discuss boundaries that you can download. It's easy to do. Just go to counsellingtutor.com, navigate to podcast episode 238, and that handout will be waiting for you. Just click on it and you'll be able to download it, and that outlines even more information on boundaries. And then we moved into getting clients, talking about if you're a private practitioner, how do you obtain clients? Who do you build relationships? Where do you look to get your client referrals? And then finally, I caught up with Mamood Ahmad and we talked about understanding the race, culture and anti-discrimination practice competence framework. And he talked about, he outlined his lecture and why it's important that this growing edge is something that really needs to be addressed by practitioners. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.